After 20 long years of negotiations, members of the World Trade Organization are close to establishing a new set of rules to discipline harmful fisheries subsidies. Together, policymakers are working to create a new deal to protect the ocean's ability to provide food, jobs, and income to countless communities across the globe. So let's have a closer look. First, why are new rules necessary? Overfishing is a pressing sustainable development challenge. Approximately 34% of marine fish stocks are already exploited beyond sustainable levels, and subsidies that increase fishing capacity and encourage overfishing are a big part of the problem. This, of course, harms the marine environment, but also the communities who depend on fish for food security and for livelihoods. The good news is that WTO members are now negotiating from one single text, and they're holding a ministerial meeting on July the 15th to finalize an agreement. So what agreement exactly are we talking about? In terms of scope, the potential new rules on fisheries subsidies would only apply to marine wild capture fishing and fishing-related activities at sea. This means that subsidies to aquaculture, to inland fisheries, and to any land-based activities would not be affected. And apart from specific circumstances, subsidies for disaster relief would also not be affected. The rules in the text cover three main substantive areas: a prohibition of subsidies for vessels or operators engaged in illegal, unreported, and unregulated, or IUU fishing, a prohibition of subsidies for the fishing of already overfished stocks, and disciplines on subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing more generally. First, WTO members are working to ban subsidies to fishing vessels or operators who are engaged in IUU fishing. Basically, under Article 3 of the draft text, governments would be obliged not to subsidize a fishing vessel, and perhaps its operator, when a determination is made that that vessel or operator was engaged in IUU fishing. That determination could be made by a coastal member, if IUU fishing has taken place in its own waters, a flag state member, if the vessel is flying its flag, or the relevant regional fisheries management organization. But what should the requirements be for a determination to trigger the rule? The text proposes that a determination must be based on evidence and follow due process to ensure that unfair determinations don't trigger a subsidy prohibition. So a fair determination will trigger an obligation to remove subsidies. But the draft text allows the subsidizing member to consider the seriousness or the repetition of an infraction when it decides how long subsidies are prohibited for, although there may be a minimum limit in place. The WTO is also debating what kind of special treatment under this rule would be appropriate for developing country members, if any. This is a recurring question throughout the negotiations. The draft text suggests that developing country members would have 2 extra years in which they could keep providing subsidies to artisanal fishers that might have been caught conducting IUU fishing within 12 nautical miles of the coast. The second substantive rule is a prohibition of subsidies to the fishing of already overfished stocks. That's covered in Article 4 of the draft text. When a coastal member state or an RFMO recognizes that a stock is in an overfished condition, considering the best scientific evidence available, then a member would be prohibited from subsidizing the fishing of that stock. But what about subsidies implemented to help remedy the situation? Here the text suggests an exception. Subsidies that aim to rebuild the overfished stock would be allowed to continue. And, much like the IUU rule, the text suggests a 2-year exemption from this rule for subsidies from developing country members to their artisanal fishing of an overfished stock within 12 nautical miles of their coast. The third substantive rule, and the one that likely has the biggest potential impact, is a set of rules on subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing more broadly. Article 5 includes a number of proposed disciplines. The first and main rule would prohibit subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, including a list of certain subsidy types that are widely considered to be the most likely to incentivize overcapacity and overfishing. This list includes subsidies to help fishers cover capital costs, like vessels or engines, and variable costs, such as fuel. But there's one important qualification. A WTO member could continue to provide these subsidies if it can show there are measures in place to maintain fish stocks at sustainable levels. The second set of rules in Article 5 focuses on fishing activities in areas beyond a member's own waters. And this includes two separate ideas. First, banning subsidies that specifically target fishing anywhere beyond a member's waters. And second, banning all subsidies that benefit fishing in the high seas when these are not regulated by a regional fisheries management organisation. The third proposed discipline under Article 5 would prohibit members from providing subsidies to vessels that don't fly their flag, ensuring that a member has flag state jurisdiction and therefore more control over the fishing it subsidises. Special and differential treatment for developing country members is a particularly important and sensitive question under Article 5. Right now, the text suggests two possible alternatives. The first alternative would grant permanent exemptions from the main prohibition of subsidies that contribute to overfishing and overcapacity for least developed country members, developing members' fleets within their own domestic territorial seas, and developing members' fleets within their domestic exclusive economic zones or under the competence of regional fisheries management organisations. This exemption would probably apply to all developing country members except for China and perhaps one or two others. The second alternative includes a permanent exemption for subsidies given by least developed countries, coupled with an exemption for subsidies for developing members' artisanal fleets, perhaps with a time limitation, but when they fish within 12 nautical miles of their shore, and an exemption, perhaps time limited, for subsidies to fishing by developing countries' fleets within their own exclusive economic zones. Small developing country members that account for small percentages of global catch and small amounts of subsidies would have the opportunity to ask for extensions for the time-limited exemptions. Now, on all of these questions, WTO members will have to come to decisions on how to strike a balance between the various interests at stake. Of course, the agreement must also address a number of legal and institutional issues on topics like notifications and transparency, dispute settlement, and monitoring compliance. For example, the draft text suggests that as part of their existing obligations to notify subsidies to the WTO, members would now have to provide some fisheries-specific information. The WTO is closer than ever to reaching an agreement to tackle harmful fisheries subsidies. With these issues in mind, WTO members just might reach a historic agreement that would help protect fish stocks and all those who depend on them.